Hi everyone, it's David Thompson again with Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. Happy New Year to you all. To get things started off in 2013, I'm joined today by Brian Craig Miller, the Assistant Professor of History and Associate Chair of History at Emporia State University, and the recent editor of A Punishment on the Nation, An Iowa Soldier Endures the Civil War, now out with Kent State University Press. So Brian, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, David.
If you could you please just start off telling us a little bit about this book? It's not your traditional monograph, so perhaps our audience can learn a little bit more about it, as well as kind of the process about how you came across such a rich trove of letters.
I was teaching an American History Survey class here at Emporia State University, and about the time we got to the American Civil War, I had a student who was in my class contact me. Her name is Catherine Walker. And she explained to me how she was having a discussion over one of the holiday meals because we sort of got to the Civil War about Thanksgiving time. And her grandmother noted that the family had a collection of about 200 letters in a very small tin box that was located in the attic. And Catherine asked if I would like to see a couple of these letters, and I said, sure, absolutely, let's see what we have here. And she brought me 5 letters from the collection. And one of those letters was the very, very first letter in the book, the one that was written before Private Silas W. Haven enlisted in the American Civil War, where he is talking very clearly about the role that slavery played, not just in the cause of the war, but how the war should be fought to a conclusion where slavery is destroyed. And I was just so fascinated by this particular letter, particularly in the amidst that I had just read Chandra Manning's book, so it seemed like this was a perfect match to what Manning had been talking about. So I asked Catherine if I could see the entire collection of letters and if we could turn this possibly into a book. And so I spent about a week and a half writing her grandmother a very detailed letter as to why I was the guy to tell their family member's life story. And the family agreed to meet. They came down to my office in Emporia. We had about an hour conversation, and then they asked me to leave my office for a few minutes, so I left the room for a little bit. I came back, and they gave me their blessing. So we spent the next 4 hours photocopying all of these letters, which were in complete pristine condition. It was like they had just been written, still preserved in the original envelopes. It was surreal in many ways to handle that many primary source documents from one particular individual. I didn't have much luck with John Bell Hood, the John Bell Hood project, because so much of Hood's stuff is scattered all over the place, so I would just get a few pieces here and there in a folder. But here, one guy's entire correspondence altogether was really remarkable. And from there, I was a huge fan of Leslie Gordon's work, so I wanted to approach her. She had the Civil War in the North series with Kent State, so we actually had coffee at, I believe it was the OAH meeting in New York City, and she was really interested in the project, and I really wanted Leslie to be part of the project. I really respected her work, and I think she gave wonderful suggestions along with the readers of the press, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. But this was my first sort of research journey into the North. I fashioned myself as a Southern historian or a Confederacy explorer, and it was fun to go north of the border to Iowa, a state I had nenever been to before until this book began.
Now, as you sit down, as you said, you had about 200 letters. How did you, how much of this, I suppose, was you, how much was working with Leslie about how you structured this, the decision, do you keep all of the letters in? How do you omit certain portions? I know you touch on it in the introduction, talking a little bit about how you edited this, how you approached it, but I wonder if you could share with our viewers kind of your thinking behind this.
Yeah, what I did, the first part was to type them all out. I was pretty fortunate that Haven's penmanship is impeccable. They could easily be read. I think only maybe 2 or 3 of the letters have been damaged. One because he had spilled his inkwell, so the top half of the letter was gone, and then 2 others it seemed were damaged by maybe water during rain and so forth, so it was a little hard to decipher them, but the rest of them were really easy to read, so it was easy to transcribe them. And then there was a lot. It was a huge book manuscript at the time period, so it was not just working with Leslie and the readers who had offered some suggestions, but then I went through all the letters and jotted down names, places, dates, events, things that I could look up in Iowa, and then journeying to Iowa helped me sort of put those pieces together, what needed to stay, what needed to go. For the most part, the letters, I would say, are over 95% intact as they are. A few of the letters towards the end of the years, as you may have noticed, or as the readers will notice, I summarized some of the things that were going on in the letters, mostly because at times it got a little bit repetitious, particularly when he was talking about events back home that it was difficult to track down particular individuals who may have been involved in a transaction to buy lumber, let's say, or some firewood. Or if he was talking about his bouts with dysentery, again, he talks about them quite a bit, but when it got completely repetitive, or if I didn't feel it was driving the story forward anymore, those little bits and pieces were cut out. But really the letters are mostly there. The goal was to let the reader really walk into Haven's world with my help sort of pointing out things here and there to help them along the way.
And as you kind of look back on this project, with it still very fresh in your mind, what value do you see in these edited, works? And a lot of them have been coming out, and I hope that they still continue to come out with various presses. As people who are both historians of the war, but also, casual buffs, if you will, what type of benefit do you see these types of work offering versus a traditional kind of narrative of a given battle or regiment, or just a political situation from the war, for instance?
I was fortunate in the fact that Haven's collection is so rich. I mean, there are so many different topics that he's touching on, even ones that I think are starting to really, you're starting to see in the historical monographs themselves. I mean, we have elements here of manhood, of discussions of guerrilla warfare, discussions of how disease are affecting the body. Those are hot topics right now in Civil War scholarship. He also contributes to this debate going on the role that slavery is playing and how it functions in the minds of Union soldiers and the Union populace as a cause of the war or a goal of the war. We're seeing quite a bit of scholarship on that, not just Chandra Manning's book, but Gary Gallagher, and then Jim Oakes' book that just came out is diving into that debate. So I think when you have episodes or instances of these soldiers who are commenting on those topics, I think it not only enriches the literature, but it gives those who are looking for research topics ample opportunities to see, well, here's one particular soldier talking about this, maybe there are others, and how do they compare. I personally feel that we could even use more of these edited collections. I feel like I learned so much about his particular worldview. I think back to a conference paper that Jason Phillips gave a couple years ago where he was asking us to think about how soldiers thought about things. And these letter collections or diaries are perfect. They're these perfect windows into their private lives. And I just found it enormously fascinating how eloquent he was. The fact that Haven also had a lot of downtime. He isn't one of these guys who's in battle very much. He sees very little military action, so he had ample time to sit down and write and talk extensively about what he was thinking about everything from slavery to guerrilla warfare to copperheads to events back home, and especially religion in this book. He talks quite a bit about faith and what he expects from the people of Iowa and the northern population in terms of their religious beliefs during the war.
I'm glad you brought up the religion element, something that's near and dear to my heart. I noticed that immediately. That jumps out from that first letter that you mentioned and discussions of slavery, that the punishment of God is right there. So I couldn't agree with you enough as to the value of these.
I was going to say, these are what the students really seem to enjoy as well, especially when they realize, this is a human being, this is an individual, this is somebody who has maybe a similar background. Haven is sort of your typical, he's a New Englander, but he ends up adopting these Midwestern values, which I think especially students here at Emporia State end up really relating to.
Now, is there a particular letter that is your favorite, or a particular facet of his thinking, his ideology that he's trying to impart in these letters that you found to be kind of the element that you connected with the most?
I think it is that opening letter where he is very clear to say that this war is a punishment on the nation. I think that's why I had to incorporate that somewhere into the title of the book itself, because you always I always think back to Lincoln's second inaugural address, and here it is sort of the theme of Lincoln's, I wonder if Lincoln knew Silas W. Haven, but the theme of Lincoln's inaugural address was about that, if this war is a punishment for the institution of slavery and that blood would need to be equal for every drop of the lash, it would be taken by the sword. It seems that Haven is echoing that sort of rhetoric from the very beginning of the war, even before he's enlisted, when he's just thinking about what the war means in February of 1862, just a few months in. I think that's what, the fact that I got to read that letter first, and it was the very first letter in the collection, I think was probably the most important one to me and why I wanted to tackle this particular project. And the other fact is, he has a lot of very interesting insights, particularly his experiences dealing with refugees, with Southern women, with his trips down the river, seeing the landscape for the first time, visiting New Orleans. He also happens to be in Nashville at the same time John Bell Hood is there, so you have sort of this fun overlap between two different projects from two different directions. So I think that is probably why I found his and plus he's really articulate. He really explains things, sometimes probably more so than you want to see, especially when he's talking about his medical problems that he's having. I haven't, working on other medical topics, you usually sometimes don't see soldiers going into such details about what they're experiencing, but he likes to go over that. He gives us his shopping list, which I think is really fun, letting his wife know I'm not blowing all the money on certain items. Here are the things I bought. Here are a couple newspapers, some tobacco. And he ate pretty well throughout the course of the war. He's always giving us his menu, which I think is a lot of fun as well.
And obviously, there's a lot to be said about soldiers who, be it in the East or the West, are just grinding out battle after battle and kind of what they're writing about and their experiences. But you look at somebody like Silas Haven. I admitted, I open it and I look and I see that he didn't do a whole lot of fighting, so to speak. So I was went in cautiously thinking, I'm very curious as to how he would write about the war, because you could see it being I was on guard duty today, again. But as you said, a very articulate man, and his way of being able to realize these very important ideas and experiences that he's having, although they're not necessarily on the front lines, for the entire war, it's very, very powerful. So.
Yeah, and the fact that he's not in these battles, I think, is something that we sometimes forget. I mean, I think even I think I'm even guilty of this myself. Is in a Civil War class, we tend to go from campaign to campaign as a narrative, and sometimes we don't take the time to say, well, what are these soldiers doing when they're not in going from campaign to campaign, or if they're not in them at all? I mean, he has a random expedition in 1862 to go up to Minnesota to collect a payment for the Union government from the Chippewa Indians. And here he is traveling along, heading far northward, away from a lot of the military action of the war. But his guard duty is obviously very important, especially guarding the Memphis-Charleston Railroad from time to time, as he does throughout the course of the war.
Right. Now, in true Civil War historian fashion, you wear many hats. Another one for you is the book review editor of Civil War history. I was wondering if you could share just a little bit with our readers what that experience is like for you.
It has been in many ways surprising. It has been fun, and I think it has really enriched my own understanding of the war very significantly, particularly because I get to see every single book that comes out. And there are a lot. There are many more Civil War books coming out rather than just our traditional academic titles. We have books that deal with art. We have some graphic novels that have come out. And my role as book review editor was also to incorporate more media in. So we've already done a film review of The Conspirator and the Robert E. Lee American Series experience, the American experience that on Robert E. Lee. We have reviews coming out on the death in the Civil War and the abolitionists for the American for the American experience. We also have TV critic Megan Kate Nelson, who is doing a review of Hell on Wheels, which will be forthcoming in the June 2013 issue. And then in the September 2013 issue, we have a roundtable of 6 Civil War historians who are going to talk about Steven Spielberg's Lincoln. And not just the film itself and the depiction of characters and so forth, but film as a medium for relaying messages about history to the general public and as a medium for teaching. there's a discussion where they're going to delve into how they've utilized film in their own teaching. There are some, I think as a book review editor, I share frustrations that other book review editors have of sometimes not getting the reviews as speedily as possible, but I found for the most part a lot of enthusiasm from reviewers, enthusiasm from our readers. We have significantly, as you may have noticed or as your viewers may have noticed, we have significantly upped the number of book reviews we're doing per issue. We started at 12 and now we're at 15 to 16 per issue. We really wanted to do as many reviews as possible on the entire Civil War era. We've done reviews on slavery, on the early republic, and we'll have reviews coming out not just on Reconstruction, but even beyond. I think I just sent a book out on Chickamauga and the Spanish-American War. So we're even drifting into the latter half of the 19th century. So it's been a great experience, and being part of a wonderful team with Leslie Gordon and Kevin Adams as editors. With the three of us really work together to make sure that the issues are as great as possible, and we've been really pleased with the feedback and support we've had from the community.
Now, any book in particular that you've come across recently that's really caught your eye, something that people should be on the lookout for recently? Just something that you think is really special when it comes to the war.
I think maybe this is tied to my own interest in that's delving around with medicine and so forth. But I think Jim Downs' book Sick from Freedom and then Megan K. Nelson's book Ruined Nation are really sort of fascinating takes on the impact that the war had on the environment, on the body, on just the landscape itself. I think this is a really interesting dimension and direction that we're going into, particularly Jim Downs' work, which I think, the main article I think that came out of Civil War history that a lot of people have been talking about recently is J. David Hacker's sort of revising the 620,000 number upwards. And I think Jim even adds further to that about the thousands of African Americans who suffered in these freedmen camps because of outbreaks of disease. It could even take that number up even higher. I think that number has a big punch. Particularly, I start my own Civil War class here at Emporia State with that number on the screen after showing a slideshow of images of the dead from the American Civil War, because I asked the class to contemplate that number and what does it mean ultimately, and then use sort of that number, if you will, as a starting point to talk about the American Civil War itself. I'm curious to see what will come next year. Particularly, I know there are a lot of titles on Gettysburg that are going to be released. I'm curious to see if we're going to have a lot of other big monograph studies. Scott Hartwig just did a big book on Antietam, which I had sent out. I was really excited to see that, but I guess I was surprised that we didn't have a huge flood of Antietam books or a huge flood of books on slavery, other than Jim Oakes' new book and then Bruce Levine's book that's about to come out. We had that in page proofs and sent that out to reviewers as well. I think those are big books with big presses that could have a large impact on how not just the academic but the general public is thinking about the American Civil War.
And I obviously can't ignore the option here of just saying to everybody, if you haven't already seen them, we did do interviews with Megan and with Jim, and we will have one coming up with Scott. So if you do want to check them, they're all on the Civil War Monitor website as well as up on YouTube. If you need to go and catch them up on them, they are fantastic interviews. Had to do that plug. Sorry. Well, finally, Brian, I was hoping you could just you've tangentially brought it up here a little bit. Your work, where you're moving next. I was wondering if you could share just a little bit more with our viewers, kind of what your next big project is.
I just finished up my manuscript on Confederate amputees with the University of Georgia Press. I'm at that stage where I'm waiting for my reader reports to come back and do some revisions and then send that off. Next, I'm going to tackle the Disneyland attraction Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. I don't know how many of your viewers have been to Disneyland, but the attraction originated at the 1964 exhibition in Flushing Meadows, New York, in the Illinois State Pavilion. It drew 25,000 visitors a day, packed lines, massive reaction to this animatronic Abraham Lincoln that discussed, a little bit of his role in the American Civil War. And I'm framing this exploration, it'll be more of an article rather than a full-length book, but framing it as, here's a moment in the midst of a very contentious centennial celebration that completely fell apart. Robert Cook has a great book on the troubled commemoration period through the centennial. But here you have this moment where you have thousands of Americans gravitating back to Lincoln, so much so that Walt Disney decides to permanently incorporate that attraction at Disneyland, and then there's a slight tweak of it in the Hall of Presidents at Disney World, and it's been there ever since. It's one of these enduring attractions that anytime Disney has thought about possibly closing the attraction, there's an uproar and outrage, and then it remains open. I think in many ways Walt Disney has contributed to a larger legacy of our memory of the American Civil War, and especially our memory of Abraham Lincoln. One that may have been an avenue for 8 generations of school children and so forth who viewed the attraction. I'm curious. It'll be fun as I embark upon this. I'm curious as to how many Civil War historians or Lincoln scholars saw great moments with Mr. Lincoln or the Hall of Presidents at a young age and were drawn to Abraham Lincoln or drawn to the story of the Civil War through that. So a little sort of a fun side trip that's going to take me out to California to do some research, but I'm excited to see where it goes.
That's a horrible, horrible plight for you, just to have to go do some research in sunny California.
Combining my love of the Walt Disney Company with the American Civil War, it's
a perfect world. Well, it sounds like a great project that we can all look forward to. Well, Brian, thank you so much for taking some time with us today. I don't want to take up too much of your day, but it's been great to have you on. I hope we can have you on again. Perhaps when the book comes out with UGA Press in the not-too-distant future. Very exciting to be in the reader report stage with that. Again, everyone, this is Brian Craig Miller, editor of A Punishment on the Nation, An Iowa Soldier Endures the Civil War. So thanks again, Brian, and I hope to see you soon.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. Have a good day.